Forget reading poems, when was the last time you listened to one? If you haven't, you're missing out on at least half the fun.
Half of not very much could be an affordable loss.
No, come on, I'm being serious. Poetry's roots are in the ancient oral traditions. Poems were spoken long before they were ever written down, and because of that, the way a poem sounds still matters a great deal. In the past, the sounds of poetry were often managed by set rhythmic patterns and regular rhyme schemes, but in our current age where free verse dominates, having an ear for language is even more important. If you're not just slapping a rhyming word on the end of every other line, what do you do? Today, we're talking about the various sound-related tools that poets have access to, and then we'll look at some examples to see how it all works in practice. Because playing with sound is, of course, more art than formula, I'm not going to tell you what you should do. Instead, the goal today is to help open you up to what's possible, because deliberate, explicit knowledge of language precedes deliberate artistic control of language. So with that in mind, how about a little vocabulary lesson?
Brought to you by the show otherwise known as Self-Sabotaging Viewer Retention with Andrew.
Oh, people love this stuff.
No, I've seen the analytics, but I've also seen there's no stopping you.
You're right, I'm just getting started. So let's take a look at the word cough. It's a word, but it's also a syllable. Most writers do care about words, but poets care more than others about syllables. Now, without getting too in the weeds, syllables are units of sound. So for clarity and precision, let's rewrite our word as a series of sounds. Now it's easier to see how the syllable is built. And look, just like atoms and cells, syllables have nuclei. 9 times out of 10, the nucleus of a syllable is a vowel, like the aw in cough. You can put multiple words together in a poem that all share the same nucleus. Cough, stop, trod, possible. When you have nucleus-sharing words in a poem, it's called assonance. So if you want to add a little vowel-based music to your writing, keep an ear out for those vowel nuclei. Now, while each syllable will have a nucleus, some syllables have extra sounds that may come before or after the nucleus. In cough, we begin with a k, and that's the onset of the syllable. You can string similar onsets together, like with assonance, but this time it's called alliteration. Cough, cat, capital. Remember, we're talking about sounds, not letters, so even though chronic and kibble are spelled differently, they both have syllable onsets that sound the same, so it's alliteration. After the nucleus, we have the coda, in this case, f. Patterns of coda-sharing syllables give us consonants. Cough, enough, laugh, skiff. And then add the coda and nucleus together and you get the conveniently spelled rhyme, which of course gives us rhyme. Cough and trough, moon and boon, egg and leg. Keep in mind too that you can have multiple sounds before or after the nucleus, and those also play a role in our sound play. So yes, cough and clasp do alliteration, but Claude and clasp do it just a little better, don't you think? So now that you know everything there is to know about single syllables, or at least everything a poet needs to know, let's magnify our fun with multi-syllables. Pop quiz, what's the difference between the words insult and insult? In terms of the words themselves, insult is a thing, insult is an action. But in terms of sound and the way we tell them apart is that the difference is one of stress. In English, as with other languages, different syllables receive different degrees of stress. And we'll talk more about formal stress rules and meters later in the series, and we've already talked about them elsewhere on the channel, but for now, it's enough to know that some syllables are stressed and some aren't. In insult, the first syllable is stressed. It's a little longer, louder, and higher pitched than the second syllable. With insult, we flip it. We put the stress on the second syllable. And any word with more than one syllable will have a stressed syllable. And as I've talked about it before, the easiest way to find that stressed syllable is to pretend you're calling that word by name. See, when you call out someone's name, you exaggerate the length, loudness, and pitch of the stressed syllable. Give it a try. Thomas, Rebecca, Miguel. And it works with regular words too. Again, give it a try. Where's the primary stress in these words? Here's the answer. How'd you do? Now, newer poets especially make the common mistake of thinking that stress placement is a lot mushier than it actually is. If you see the word insult out of context, sure, you might not know which syllable to stress, but there'd be no doubt as soon as you knew whether it was a noun or a verb. If you see the word policy out of context, though, There's no question. The first syllable of policy is always the primary stress, and it's always regrettable and never regrettable. In fact, stress placement is so reliable that if you're really having a hard time finding it by ear at first, any good dictionary will tell you where it goes. Some longer words may have the primary stress, which you can always find by calling out the word, and secondary stress, which isn't as long, loud, or high-pitched as the primary stress, but still a little more than their neighbors. And as you get better at hearing stresses, you shouldn't have any trouble. But again, stress placement really isn't up for debate. So any good dictionary will show you where the primary and secondary stresses go, usually with a little notch up top for the primary stress and a little notch below for a secondary stress. But there's one more thing I want to show you. If the sounds of individual letters is how you get the melodic qualities of rhyme, assonance and alliteration, the patterns of stress across syllables is how you get rhythm. And in English, that's because, for whatever reason, stressed syllables tend to fall at fairly regular intervals, with unstressed syllables kind of fitting in between wherever they can. So check this out. The big cake. The big red cake. The bigger red cake. The biggest reddest cake. The biggest reddest dessert. Keep piling in unstressed syllables and the drumbeat of stresses remains more or less constant, and that's interesting because it means you can use stresses to control pacing. So imagine these two lines. I stepped outside to see a huge, dark, frightful storm, and I stepped outside to see a furious, tempestuous, terrifying whirlwind. Now what do you notice? To my ear, the string of single stressed syllables in the first feels pretty heavy and imposing. They stack up to build tension through the line, each new adjective more oppressive than the last. But in the second, the storm feels less imposing, but because we're getting so many more syllables in nearly the same amount of time, it feels instead more frenetic. And again, we could get really lost in the prosodic weeds, but for now, just know that stress is out there, that the balance of stressed syllables and unstressed syllables is how you can control rhythmic effects in your poetry. But that's enough info dumping for now.
But enough came and went about 7 years ago.
So let's take a look at some actual poems. And by take a look, I do mean have a listen. The poems, as always, are linked in full below, but if today is all about ear training, it just wouldn't do to read them, would it? So I'll play some lines from these pieces, and it's your job to notice what you hear. After, we'll talk about some of the technical things going on in them. Okay, first up, the poem Imagine by Juan Felipe Herrera. Just listen, just notice.
If I jumped up high into my papa's army truck and left our village of farm workers and waved adios to my amiguitos. If I let the stars at night paint my blanket with milky light, with shapes of hungry birds while I slept outside.
Well, what did you hear? These lines are marked with strong assonance, that aw sound in papa, farm, adios, and stars. It's not the kind of music that would grab you firmly and shake you up a little, but it's still a quiet thread of acoustic consistency that gives the piece a real unity or an integrity of sound. As a bonus, these lines play with shared vowel sounds across languages. Farm and stars in English, and adios and amiguitos in Spanish. Now, we could be rigorous phoneticians and talk about the nuances of difference between the languages, but we're not phoneticians, we're poets. And Herrera makes good use of both languages to weave this thread of aw sounds throughout the piece. And night and light rhyme, and blanket and birds gives us a little alliteration. Even without the rules of traditional poetic forms, Herrera is still writing poetry that's meant to be read out loud, that's meant to be heard. But it goes on.
If I moved to the winding city of tall, bending buildings and skipped to a new concrete school I had never seen.
Listen to the sounds and rhythm of tall, bending buildings and skipped to a new concrete school. Alliteration, consonants, combinations of the two, and look at the long-voiced consonants of tall, bending buildings and how they contrast with the short, voiceless consonants of skipped to a new concrete school. Herrera is not following the rhythmic rules of iambic pentameter. He's using the sounds of language to evoke what he's writing about and to shape our response to them. The city buildings loom large and linger even in the mouth. The school, though, is hard and compact, and it sounds that way. As we'll continue to see in these other examples, the words that end up in these poems are not just the most precise words, which we've talked about before. They're also words that sound good, and importantly, the sounds of them serve the overall experience. Yes, meaning is important. Sound is also important, and different poets find the balance in different ways. So now let's turn our ear to Seamus Heaney, a Nobel Prize-winning poet, to see how he handled his sounds in the poem Blackberry Picking.
Round hayfields, cornfields, and potato drills, we trekked and picked until the cans were full, until the tinkling bottom had been covered with green ones, and on top, big dark blobs burned like a plate of eyes.
I like the little rhythmic repetition and variation we get in hayfields, cornfields, and potato drills. Trekked and picked, that's some delightful consonance, just barely missing a rhyme. And on top, big, dark blobs burned like a plate of eyes. Check that out. Big, dark blobs burned. 4 heavy, imposing, massive stressed syllables all in a row that magnify those gigantic blackberries. Heaney is using syllable stress to create a tension that we hear and feel, and it amplifies the image of the berries in the bucket.
We hoarded the fresh berries in the byre, but when the bath was filled, we found a fur, a rat-grey fungus, glutting on our cash. The juice was stinking too.
And then the berries in the byre in the bath. Alliteration is always going to make me a little happier. And then the fur, the rat-gray fungus. Notice how alliteration works to build unity in the line. The fur, the fungus, it's the same thing, and the sound reinforces the link between them. They're paired grammatical units, and they share similar sounds. So sound isn't just decorative. It's not just about sounding nice. It's also a vehicle of meaning. Sound can amplify images just as well as it can reinforce grammatical structures. Cool, huh?
You don't really want an answer, do you?
Hey, as long as it agrees with me, I'll take any answer you want to give.
Never mind then, just do the next one.
Okay, I will. As Robert Frost said at the beginning of his essay, The Figure a Poem Makes, no one but a humanist much cares how sound a poem is if it is only a sound. Now, I am, of course, a humanist, so I might be satisfied with a poem if all it does is sound good. But of course, a poem should be more than just sound. That said, Frost also then writes, the sound is the gold in the ore. If you don't care how your writing sounds, well, you probably might as well just write essays. Sound is essential to the poem in a way that it just isn't for other types of writing. It is the gold in the ore. And for me, there are few poets who charge their ore with gold as delightfully as Kay Ryan. So let's conclude with her poem, Deer.
To lure a single swivel ear, one tentative twig of a leg, or a nervous tail here, is to mark this place as the Emperor's Park. Rife, I say rife with deer.
We're just listening today, so we don't know how this poem appears in print. But just look at all the resonances and shared sounds and echoes just in these first few lines. Lure doesn't rhyme with ear, but it sure comes close, like twig and leg. Lure and leg get along too. Single, swivel, nervous, here, and deer in both the title and end of the line rhyme, as do mark and park. Plus tentative twig, the ner in nervous, and the double in emperor. Oh, and the rhythmic variation. Rife, I say rife with deer. Just look at the network of sound built into this little fragment of a poem. It's just frankly incredible, and Kay Ryan does such a careful job of it too. The sounds are dense, but they don't sound cartoonish. If you steer too far into alliteration or rhyme, you're probably going to sound like a silly children's book. But Ryan manages to do both without falling over into ridiculousness. And we see more of the same at the end.
A buck looks up. The touch of his rack against wet bark whispers a syllable singular to deer. The next one hears and shifts. The next head stops and lifts, deeper and deeper into the park.
Buck, looks, rack, bark, park, even next. A succession of syllables ending in the same sound. Ooh, and look at this. Whispers a syllable singular to deer. Here's a handy trick. The coda consonant in the first syllable of whispers matches the onset in syllable and singular. But because those sounds don't occur in all the same place in the word, the alliteration is quieter than it would be if it were something like susurrates a syllable singular to deer. That would be a caricature, where Ryan's line is, I think, far more elegant, and it manages to do it with simpler language. And of course, we have to look at the next one hears and shifts, and the next head stops and lifts. Only doing the same thing gets pretty predictable and boring. Yes, you can write a piece where every word starts with the same sound, but that trick plays itself out kind of quickly. And you can go in the opposite direction and ensure that none of the words start with the same sound, but then there's no basis for resonance. Here, though, we get the sweetest of sweet spots to my ear. The rhythm and grammatical structure is constant across these two clauses, but the words vary, with head even looking like hears, and shifts and lifts rhyming rather than matching. Now, I've mentioned it a couple of times already, but that kind of repetition and variation is just what my ears want to hear. Build up those predictable patterns, but then twist them just a little to make them surprising. That's what it's all about. But I could gush about sound all day.
Please don't. They get to do other things after this, but I'm stuck here.
Okay, I was just about to say that I wouldn't. Relax, bud.
You relax.
Anyway, I really could, and we didn't even get to Gerard Manley Hopkins, but we have talked plenty about his poetry in other videos. At any rate, there are a few lessons to take away from today. One, of course, is that sound is a technical aspect of poetry, with its own vocabulary and technique. I think it's much harder to control the way your poetry sounds if you just don't know the names of things. So take some time to practice identifying alliteration and stressed syllables and everything else we talked about at the beginning of the video today. But more importantly, so much of poetry's history has been closely linked with spoken language. Of course, now a lot of poetry is written and read in silence, and not everyone experiences sound in the same way. But if you and your audience experience the sound of language, you're leaving so much poetic potential untouched if you don't ever think about the way your poems sound. Now, there isn't one way to do it, though, so the best thing to do is to listen. Read your own poems out loud. Read poems aloud when you encounter them. Most poets write with the ear at least as much as they do with their eyes. And not everyone can attend poetry readings, but if you're watching this video, you can absolutely find poetry readings elsewhere on YouTube. As much as you can, find poets reading their own poems. You might have to get past some videos of actors reading poems, and nothing against actors, but they're trained to do different things for different reasons than poets. So listen to poets and train your ear the way you first learned the language, by just listening. When I think of my most meaningful experiences with poetry, almost all of them involve poetry spoken aloud. Whether I've been reading my own work or listening to someone read theirs, or even just reading a favorite poem out loud in my living room, poetry is, to me at least, at its most vital and meaningful when the words leave the page and leap into the air. So I know we poets tend to be among the quieter ones out there, but don't be shy. Poetry lives in the voice, so let us hear yours in the way your poems sound. And so, until next time, keep on writing.